Hello everyone, welcome to the course on Health Humanities, Indian and Western Medical Knowledge Traditions. This is lecture number 22 on representation of trauma in South Asian fiction. In this lecture, I will talk about the origin and development of trauma in different South Asian nations. And the focus of my lecture will be how the nature of trauma in different South Asian nations have different origins, and what a role historical context has to play, and what are the social and cultural conditions that have influenced the experiences of trauma in these countries. And then I'll be examining some of the select novels from India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka. And in my analysis, in my study, I'll be focusing on how trauma in these different countries have different origins and how they differ in terms of their experiences, their representations, and what are the problems, what are the crises which are there in representing the trauma in different contexts. And the trauma which these countries are having are social and political in nature. They are individual as well as collective. They are cultural and political. They are embedded in historical and political violence. It is a part of partition. It is a part of Bangladesh Liberation War and so many other contexts. And it also has its relation with the involvement of US and Russia in Afghanistan and the turmoil state of the country, which has led to different kind of traumatic experiences for both men and women. And the experiences of women about the trauma are very depressing as well as something which needs further analysis and critique. The women who experience trauma, they are the one who are displaced politically or who are marginalized socially, and they also face gender violence. And hence they face double kind of marginalization, and their experiences of trauma are equally double. And the origin of trauma in Indian and South African contexts also have colonial origins, and it has some role to play it. To move further, let us first talk about the trauma and the different perspectives. When we look at trauma from psychological perspective, it is often defined as a psychological response to an event that profoundly impacts an individual's mental health, emphasizing the emotional and mental representation that can persist over time. So psychologically, trauma is a kind of mental scar, a mental wound, which lies in the mind of person, at the back of the mind of person for a long time, and then it reoccurs at a certain point of time. As I have said in the previous lecture, that it has a kind of certain amnesia, and then it has certain recurrence and certain forgetting. So this is not that the memory of trauma is forever there. It can disappear as well as appear at any point of time. And once it appears, it seriously affects the mental health of the person who is concerned. When we look at the cultural point of view, the cultural interpretations of trauma involves understanding how different societies perceive and narrate traumatic experiences, which can influence individual and collective healing process. Which means that trauma has also a cultural origins, and sometimes the people from different cultural locations may not be able to perceive and understand the suffering, the problem of an individual. So trauma is located socially as well as culturally. And depending upon one's cultural locations, cultural background, social background, One has different experiences of trauma as well as different healing methods. And sometimes the people who are not part of the cultural narratives, they may not understand that the trauma which one is going through, the trauma which one is facing. Hence, cultural interpretation of trauma needs an understanding of different societies and how they narrate these traumatic experiences. When we think about trauma in the South Asian context, particularly in the novels of South Asian writers, then we find that their representation of trauma has both social as well as literary significance. When we study trauma in the South Asian novels, they reveal socio-political contexts of trauma. Socio-political in the sense that they reveal how trauma has been embedded in certain social and political situations of a particular country, and how these social and political situations, for example, the war and violence in Bangladesh during its liberation in 1971, the terrorist and unstable state of Pakistan and its impact on the people, particularly women, and then the role of Taliban, the role of Russian and US soldiers, and how they have affected, how they have displaced women there, and then how they affect their experiences of life over there, and leading to a very depressing and mentally torturing kind of trauma. So we find that the socio-political conditions as well as the local conflicts, the international conflict, the displacements have a lot of role in the life of a person and their experiences of trauma, and which also cause sometimes the identity crisis in the people who are facing it. When we look at trauma from the point of the view of literature, it enriches the narrative. It offers a medium for asserting, for reclaiming those voices, the voices of those people who are marginalized or who are living on the margins of society. So literature provides a new space for recording, narrating, transmitting the experiences of people who are living on the margins of society, and it provides them a space to locate as well as to share their own experiences. Moreover, the literary representation of trauma contributes in understanding shared human experiences amidst different cultural narratives. So literary experiences of trauma, or literary representation of trauma, at one point provides new themes, new mediums in the literary domain, but at the same time it becomes a medium which can also help them in healing process, because storytelling and narrative medicine are the very important components of medical humanities, and which helps them to structure one's emotions, one's persons, one's thought process. So when we think about literary representation, trauma can actually bring the idea of what Arthur Frank calls in his book The Wounded Storyteller, that story can be organized in two different ways. One, which he calls restitution narrative. Number two, chaos narrative. And third, quest narrative. So, our quest story. So, narrative and story are very significant in representing trauma. It is also significant in healing traumatic experiences. When we look at the historical context of trauma in the South Asian nations, as I said earlier, that it has been influenced by the local problems. It is also about the erosion of traditional practices and identities, and at the same time, there is some kind of imposition of foreign cultural norms, which result in a complex struggle for self-definition. When we think about the partition of 1947 or the liberation of Bangladesh in 1971, they have caused immense suffering, where millions of people have been displaced, killed, raped, and they have faced all kinds of traumatic experiences, leaving a deep and long-lasting scars on their mind, and which continues to affect the relationships of people living there and challenging their identities. It affects their present day experiences and present day relations with their communities. So the trauma of partition, the trauma of the liberation of Bangladesh has a long-lasting and ever evolving and ever finding a new domain of expressions, which needs further exploration. When we think about trauma in the contemporary context of the South Asian nations, we find that different kinds of conflicts and displacements, gender-based violence have been pivotal in representing trauma. When we think about in the Indian context, and when we had insurgency in Kashmir or insurgency in Northeast, and around a decade ago or over a decade ago, which has caused a tremendous cycle of violence leading to large-scale displacement of the citizens, of the people, and complicating the ties between different communities, which affected not only their livelihood, but also their mental well-being. So the people who are displaced by some kind of local conflicts, but it has a larger scale of the experiences of trauma. Further, the gender-based violence are one of the contemporary forms of trauma. So when we think about gender-based abuses, which are not only actually disregarding the position of women, but also affecting their mental health. And moreover, the socio-economic disparities also affect and cause gender-based violence. So it impacts the rights of women, their safety, and perpetuate a cycle of trauma, perpetuate different kind of traumatic experiences. And moving further, when we consider the key themes of trauma in the South Asian fiction, so the novels which I have selected, when we look at and when we examine those novels, I'll come one by one to those novels. They have the trauma of otherness, violence, survival. It can be political violence, it can be violence of attacks, it can be because of insurgencies, because of terrorist attack, or because of some kind of international bombings. Then we have trauma of historical memory, that the past memory of traumatic experiences, the past memory of violence have the consequences in the present time. Further, there are some novels which deal trauma as a cultural trope, where the cultural experiences shape and modify the traumatic experiences. And then we have trauma which is domestic, as well as which are based upon gendered violence. Trauma is both collective as well as individual. It is social as well as personal. So let us come to the novels. The novels which I have selected, I have taken novels from India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. From India, I have selected Mahasuta Devi and Basarat P. From Sri Lanka, there is a novelist called Michael Undachi. From Nepal, Manju Sri Thapa. From Afghanistan, Khalid Hosseini and Siba Saqib. From Bangladesh, Tahmina Anam, and from Pakistan, Mohsin Hamid and Kamila Shamsi. Their novels provide different angles of trauma, different experiences of trauma, and different modes of healing, different modes of suffering which one has undergone. When we think about Mahasweta Devi, her novels talk about the otherness and violence and survival, particularly in the northeastern states, and it reveals that how the traumatic experiences are embodied as well as embedded in cultural and social conflicts. It can be conflicts based upon religious as well as social violence. It can be conflict based upon cultural practices. Moreover, her novels talk about the plight of poor and tribals in the stories like Salt, Paddy Seeds, and Water. Her novella, The Mother of 1984, which was written in Bengali as Hajar Chaurasi Ki Maa. It talks about Naxalbari movement and the people who died during that movement. And it has led to a large number of displacement of people, large number of the displacement of the people who are poor, who are tribal, and most of the people who got killed, and which has led to the displacement as well as suffering of people, which have a very long scale impact on the psyche of people. Basarat Peer, who is a Kashmiri writer, journalist, and in his memoir, he talks about the trauma of survival. His memoir, The Curfew Night, is political in nature. It talks about the people, the suffering of people in Kashmir, and their cultural memories, their experiences of traumatic cultural memories in the Kashmir Valley. The story talks about the individual experience of Basarat Peer, but it transforms them as a collective experience. So the individual memory of the author becomes the experiences of all the people who were displaced, who were marginalized, or the people whose family have lost their near and dear ones because of terrorist attacks or because of some kind of insurgencies. And the experiences in these like households are so strong that it keeps reoccurring when some other incident, some other terrorist attack, some other kind of insurgency happens, and hence the experiences of people have been transformed into post-traumatic stress disorder, which can reoccur at any point of time when there are similar kind of narrative experiences, similar kind of situations, which reminds people of certain problems which they have faced earlier. Michael Ontaji, who is a Sri Lankan author, in his novel Anil's Ghost, he talks about trauma of body, memory, and displacement, which dislocates the sense of identity, family, and place in order to localize and realize the traumatic experiences. He blends memory and subjectivity with the history and cultural identity of the characters and represents them in the contemporary context. So Anil's Ghost represents the experiences of people, but then brings them in the contemporary context to make people realize that the experiences of people are forever new, forever green, and the traumatic experiences can never be forgotten. When we think about the Nepali writer Manju Sri Thapa, in her writings, All of Us in Our Own Lives explores the theme of identity, displacement, and narrates the story of an encounter between two strangers who shapes each other's lives. So the idea of displacement, idea of violence are common to almost most of the South Asian writers. And The novel deals with the story of a Canadian lawyer who quits her corporate law and leaves her personless marriage and moves to Nepal. She depicts her struggle to launch a new career and to forge a connection with the country of her birth. It depicts the individual's struggle and her personal trauma. In this way, Manjushree Thapa is able to depict personal trauma as well as the trauma based upon displacement, as well as since we have a person who is Canadian in origin, so we have the trauma which have been experienced based upon cultural differences. When we think about Khalid Hosseini, the Afghanistani writer, in his novels, A Thousand Splendid Suns, or the other one, The Kite Runner, we found that trauma is a central theme in his novels. He talks about the disturbed country of Afghanistan, which is caught between the interventions of Soviet Union and United States. The main characters in this novel, A Thousand Splendid Suns, have their problems at the level of politics, at the level of social and cultural norms. And the characters like Miriam and Laila, they are actually trapped in the Afghan society, and there they face domestic violence and oppression. The domestic violence and oppression and oppressive social norms confine women, and the woman character Mariam, she faces abuse from her husband Rashid. The people are also facing traumatic experiences because of the ongoing war between Soviet and Taliban, and then US and Taliban. At one point of time, Soviet and US have helped the Taliban, and later on they began to fight with them. So the conflict between the war between Taliban with Soviet and the US have caused a large number of displacement, and it has led to the invasion of the country Afghanistan, which has led to the rise of Taliban. And once Taliban comes into power, Taliban holds certain power at certain territories, certain localities. It has made the life of women very miserable, and hence the condition of women have become very, very grim. There are certain characters who also have childhood trauma. For example, Mariam's childhood is characterized by neglect and abandonment, with her mother Nana facing societal rejection and her father Jalil being emotionally distant. So we have trauma which continues from one's birth, and the people who are experiencing trauma, they find some kind of societal rejection. They find themselves emotionally distant. And then there are traumas which are intergenerational, which comes from generation to generations. For example, Laila, she is influenced by the trauma of her mother, and then who has the trauma of her grandmother. So this way we have trauma from one generation to another generation to another generation, and then coming to the present generation. So people are having traumatic experiences at multiple levels. When we think about the woman writer from Afghanistan, Siba Saqib, in her novels Afghanistan Where God Comes to Weep and Samira and Samir, she talks about different types of experiences which women had in Afghanistan. In the novel Afghanistan Where God Only Comes to Weep, she portrays the existential crisis experienced by women in a war-torn country, where they are used as pawns in the game of power politics, where women live a very miserable life. They are displaced, they survive as a refugee in Pakistan. For example, the young woman Sherin Gol, her home place, her village was attacked by the Russian bomb in 1979. And once she has become homeless and she comes to Pakistan as a refugee, and then she finds that there is no hope in Pakistan. So she has trauma of displacement as well as trauma of not having any kind of means to survive. So trauma of survival is also very significant in the life of Sherin Gol. Further, she is forced into marriage to pay her brother's debt, and she has been also forced in selling her body. When we think about the other novels, Samira and Samir, this is a condition of this depicts the condition of women in Afghanistan. Though this is like individual experience, but it can be seen as a larger societal problem. Samira is a girl, but she is not having means, she is not having facilities, and she is not allowed to go for schools, because women are not allowed to study in Afghanistan because of the interventions of Taliban. And then her father brings Samira as a boy. For a point of time, for a period of time, she lives, she survives as a boy, so that she cannot be tortured for being a girl. However, she has the problem of maintaining her identity, whether she should consider herself as a lady Samira or as a boy Samir. So the conflict of identity has become also very significant. Think about Tahmina Anam, a Bangladeshi writer. Her novel A Golden Age talks about the conflict between the protagonist Rihanna, who loses the custody of her children after the death of her husband. And then circumstances have forced her to face a heartbreaking dilemma and her struggle to keep her family safe. In the next novel, The Good Muslims, which narrates the tumultuous history of 1971 war and its victim, one of the characters, her name is Maya. She is a village doctor who helps the victims of the Bangladesh Liberation War, where women have been raped, and once they get conceived after rape, and they may face societal stigma for having an illegitimate child. So Maya helps those women to get to abort their children. And in this way, we find these novels depicting the trauma of women who have been raped and who have conceived, and their experiences have become very traumatic and distressing. And finally, let us come to Pakistani novelist Mohsin Hamid. In his novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist talks about the experiences of a young Pakistani his name is Changez, who is residing in New York. But after the 9/11 attack, the American people look at him with some kind of hostility and suspicion. They doubt him that he may be a terrorist, and because he is wearing a particular kind of clothes, as well as his particular kind of appearance in terms of beard, etc. And it reveals that the experiences of Mohsin Hamid, his character Changez is based upon racial discrimination. It is a prejudice against the South Asian people living in the Western countries, in the American countries, and which challenges their identity and makes them suffer. So this is a trauma of identity crisis which Changez faces. Another Pakistani novelist, Kamila Shamsi, in her novel Burnt Shadows, talks about the histories of two families who have like left Japan at the time of atomic bombing in Nagasaki. It brings also the memories of the partition of India, as well as the rise of militancy and then military dictatorship in Pakistan. Further, the story narrates the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001 in the United States, and then the following, the war on terror in Afghanistan. So it talks about different kinds of partitions, different kind of militancy, different kind of wars, which different countries have faced, and the experiences of trauma which one is having. This narrative embodies the geographical journey of the protagonist and then brings her insight in a series of global catastrophes. It can be personal, national, cultural, as well as it can be universal. In her another novel, God in Every Stone is a story about friendship, injustice, love, and betrayal. It gives the histories of Turkey and Pakistan and places them in the context of World War I. The theme of the loss of innocence is present in the novel. So this novel talks about the trauma of betrayal, the trauma of World War I, and then how it is associated with the different kind of traumatic histories, the histories of the turbulent histories of Pakistan and Turkey. So to conclude, the South Asian fictions have been characterized by the predominance of the trauma of partition, war, violence, and social inequality. Further, South Asian novels depict the trauma of displacement, dislocation, and disorientation. Moreover, when we think about the novels of like Kamila Shamsie, or maybe what you call the reluctant fundamentalist, we find that these novels cross the regional boundaries. When we read the novels of Bangladeshi writer Tahmina Anam, they cross the regional boundaries and depict cross-cultural traumatic experiences. And further, I will talk about trauma in different contexts in the next lecture. Thank you.